On the Soul and the Resurrection by Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Part 5. And yet, I rejoined to the Virgin, we see no slight help afforded for improvement to the virtuous from all these conditions. Daniel's desire was his glory, and Phineas's anger pleased the deity. We have been told, too, that fear is the beginning of wisdom, and learned from Paul that salvation is the goal of the sorrow after a godly sort. The gospel bids us have contempt for danger, and the not being afraid with any amazement is nothing else but a description of courage, and this last is numbered by wisdom among the things that are good. In all this, Scripture shows that such emotional conditions are not to be considered weaknesses. Weaknesses would not have been so employed for putting virtue into practice. I think, replied the teacher, that I am myself responsible for this confusion arising from different accounts of the matter, for I did not state it as distinctly as I might have, by introducing a certain order of consequences for our consideration. Now, however, some such order shall, as far as it is possible, be devised, so that our essay may advance in the way of logical sequence, and so give no room for such contradictions. We declare, then, that the speculative, critical, and world-surveying faculty of the soul is its peculiar property by virtue of its very nature, and that thereby the soul preserves within itself the image of the divine grace, since our reason surmises that divinity itself, whatever it may be in its inmost nature, is manifested in these very things, universal supervision, and the critical discernment between good and evil. But all those elements of the soul which lie on the borderland and are capable from their peculiar nature of inclining to either of two opposites, whose eventual determination to the good or to the bad depends on the kind of use they are put to. Anger, for instance, and fear, and any other such-like emotion of the soul, divested of which human nature cannot be studied. All these we reckon as accretions from without, because in the beauty, which is man's prototype, no such characteristics are to be found. Now, let the following statement be offered as a mere exercise in interpretation. I pray that it may escape the sneers of cavilling hearers. Scripture informs us that the deity proceeded by a sort of graduated and ordered advance to the creation of man. After the foundations of the universe were laid, as history records, man did not appear on the earth at once, but the creation of the brutes preceded his, and the plants preceded them. Thereby Scripture shows that the vital forces blended with the world of matter according to a gradation. First, it infused itself into insensate nature, and in continuation of this, advanced into the sentient world, and then ascended to intelligent and rational beings. Accordingly, while all existing things must either be corporeal or spiritual, the former are divided into the animate and inanimate. By animate, I mean possessed of life, and of things possessed of life, some have it with sensation, sentient, the rest have no sensation. Again, of these sentient things, some have reason, the rest have not. Seeing then that this life of sensation could not possibly exist apart from the matter which is the subject of it, and the intellectual life could not be embodied either without growing in the sentient. On this account, the creation of man is related as coming last, as of one who took up into himself every single form of life, both that of plants and that which is seen in brutes. His nourishment and growth he derives from vegetable life, for even in vegetables such processes are to be seen, when nourishment is being drawn in by their roots, and given off in fruit and leaves. His sentient organization he derives from the brute creation, but his faculty of thought and reason is incommunicable, and is a peculiar gift in our nature to be considered by itself. However, just as this nature has the instinct acquisitive of the necessaries to material existence, an instinct which, when manifested in us men, we call appetite, and as we admit this appertains to the vegetable form of life, since we can notice it there too, like so many impulses working naturally to satisfy themselves with their kindred aliment, and to issue in germination, so all the peculiar conditions of the brute creation are blended with the intellectual part of the soul. To them, she continued, belongs anger. To them belongs fear. To them all those other opposing activities within us, everything except the faculty of reason and thought. That alone, the choice product, as has been said, of all our life, bears the stamp of the divine character. But since, according to the view which we have just enunciated, it is not possible for this reasoning faculty to exist in the life of the body without existing by means of sensations, and since sensation is already found subsisting in the brute creation, necessarily, as it were, by reason of this one condition, our soul has touch with the other things which are knit up with it, and these are all those phenomena within us which we call passions, which have not been allotted to human nature for any bad purpose at all, for the Creator would most certainly be the author of evil if, so deeply rooted as they are in our nature, any necessities of wrongdoing were found in them. But according to the use which our free will puts them to, these emotions of the soul become the instruments of virtue or vice. They are like the iron which is being fashioned according to the volition of the artificer, and receives whatever shape the idea which is in his mind prescribes, and becomes a sword or some agricultural implement. Supposing, then, that our reason, which is our nature's choicest part, holds the dominion over these imported emotions, as Scripture allegorically declares in the command to men to rule over the brutes, none of them will be active in the ministry of evil. Fear will only generate within us obedience, and anger fortitude, and cowardice caution, and the instinct of desire will procure for us the delight that is divine and perfect. But if reason drops the reins and is dragged behind like a charioteer who has got entangled in his chariot, then these instincts are changed into fierceness, just as we see happen among the brutes. For since reason does not preside over the natural impulses that are implanted in them, the more irascible animals, under the generalship of their anger, mutually destroy each other, while the bulky and powerful animals get no good themselves from their strength, but become by their want of reason slaves of that which has reason. neither are the activities of their desire for pleasure employed on any of the higher objects, nor does any other instinct to be observed in them result in any profit for themselves. Thus too with ourselves, if these instincts are not turned by reasoning into the right direction, and if our feelings get the mastery of our mind, the man is changed from a reasoning into an unreasoning being, and from God-like intelligence sinks by the force of these passions to the level of the brute. Much moved by these words, I said, "To anyone who reflects, indeed, your exposition, advancing as it does in this consecutive manner, though plain and unvarnished, bears sufficiently upon it the stamp of correctness, and hits the truth. And to those who are expert only in the technical methods of proof, a mere demonstration suffices to convince. But as for ourselves, we were agreed that there is something more trustworthy than any of these artificial conclusions, namely, that which the teachings of Holy Scripture point to. And so I deem that it is necessary to inquire, in addition to what has been said, whether this inspired teaching harmonizes with it all." "And who," she replied, "could deny that truth is to be found only in that upon which the seal of scriptural testimony is set? So, if it is necessary that something from the Gospels should be adduced in support of our view, a study of the parable of the wheat and the tares will not be out of place here. The householder there sowed good seed, and we are plainly the house. But the enemy, having watched for the time when men slept, sowed that which was useless in that which was good for food, setting the tares in the very middle of the wheat. The two kinds of seed grew up together, for it was not possible that seed put into the very middle of the wheat should fail to grow up with it. But the superintendent of the field forbids the servants to gather up the useless crop, on account of their growing at the very root of the opposite sort, so as not to root up the nutritious along with that foreign growth. Now, we think that Scripture means by the good seed the corresponding impulses of the soul, each one of which, if only they are cultivated for good, necessarily will put forth the fruit of virtue within us. But since there has been scattered among these the bad seed of the error of judgment as to the true beauty, which is alone in its intrinsic nature such, and since this last has been thrown into the shade by the growth of delusion which springs up along with it, for the active principle of desire does not germinate and increase in the direction of that natural beauty which was the object of its being sown in us, but it has changed its growth so as to move toward a bestial and unthinking state. This very error as to beauty carrying its impulse toward this result. And in the same way, the seed of anger does not steel us to be brave, but only arms us to fight with our own people. And the power of loving deserts its intellectual objects and becomes completely crazy for the immoderate enjoyment of the pleasures of sense. And so, in like manner, our other affections put forth the worse instead of the better growths. On account of this, the wise husbandman leaves this growth that has been introduced among his seed to remain there, so as to secure our not being altogether stripped of better hopes by desire having been rooted out along with that good-for-nothing growth. If our nature suffered such a mutilation, what will there be to lift us up to grasp the heavenly delights? If love is taken from us, how shall we be united to God? If anger is to be extinguished, what arms shall we possess against the adversary? Therefore, the husbandman leaves those bastard seeds within us, not for them always to overwhelm the more precious crop, but in order that the land itself, for so in his allegory he calls the heart, by its native inherent power, which is that of reasoning, may wither up the one growth, and may render the other fruitful and abundant. But if that is not done, then he commissions the fire to mark the distinction in the crops. If, then, a man indulges these affections in a due proportion, and holds them in his own power, instead of being held in theirs, employing them for an instrument, as a king does his subjects' many hands, then efforts toward excellence more easily succeed for him. But should he become their property, and as when any slaves mutiny against their master, gets enslaved by those slavish thoughts, and ignominiously bows before them, a prey to his natural inferiors, he will be forced to turn to those employments which his imperious masters command. This being so, we shall not pronounce these emotions of the soul, which lie in the power of their possessors for good or for ill, to be either a virtue or a vice. But whenever their impulse is towards what is noble, then they become matter for praise, as his desire did for Daniel, and his anger for Phineas, and their grief to those who nobly mourn. But if they incline toward baseness, then these are and are called bad passions. She ceased after this statement, and allowed the discussion a short interval, in which I reviewed mentally all that had been said. End of Part 5.